good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Good morning for me, but good
Good
evening.
morning for you. Thanks so much for joining me. Could you start by telling us your name?
Yeah, my name is Sam Stein.
And where were you born, Sam?
I was born in New York on Long Island.
Oh, wow. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about growing up, what that looked like for you?
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in a place called the Five Towns, which is kind of very, if you know, you know, this sort of mega hub of very politically far right, politically conservative, Orthodox Jewish community in New York. That's really kind of like this, like I said, this hub of the entire kind of tri-state area Orthodox Jewish world. Um, and that's why I grew up, very insular, incredibly right wing. And I kind of, I'm sure we'll get into all of this as this conversation continues, but grew up in that environment, could kind of tell that something was fishy and smelled the bullshit on some stuff that I was raised on, like kind of really saw through from a young age of very blatant racism and homophobia and bigotry, and really didn't second guess some other stuff, um, especially Zionism.
Mhm.
That part I kind of always took for granted, and was always kind of a black sheep, and eventually kind of graduated from high school, came here for a year. In that world, it's kind of the complete norm. I wouldn't even call it a gap year. It's kind of just part of the plan. Is
And when
high
you say
school.
now, for people that aren't aware, where are you
Yeah,
right
yeah. Sorry. Here being Israel Palestine. I'm currently in Jerusalem, and yeah, after high school, I did a year studying Torah in, like I said, in that community. Kind of the norm is high school, year studying Torah in Israel, then college. And I went to this kind of mechina, which is an army prep program, actually in a settlement in the West Bank that I had no idea what that meant at the time in Efrat. Um, and yeah, kind of we can get into the specifics, but long story short, had that year, didn't know what any of it meant at the time, went to college, learned some more, kind of left orthodoxy, really developed my own politics, eventually moved back here and have been doing solidarity activism for the past 6 years.
How did you come to be in solidarity with Palestinians in Palestine? How did this come about?
Yes, so like I said, spent that whole time on my gap year, like not really left having no solid understanding of what the word occupation means or what the settlements are or what the West Bank is.
Uh-huh.
Really spent the whole year completely oblivious to all of that, went through the checkpoint, pretty daily to enter Israel with no understanding of what that checkpoint was, like something. And ironically, because of that lack of knowledge, something about it weirded me out. I was just like, wait, why do they check us on the way out, but not on the way in? If you check is a strong word. We always drove right through. But, there was like an actual barrier leaving, but not entering. Saw some stuff over that year that like didn't really sit right with me. Like the different license plates for Palestinians really just screamed Jim Crow. Um, and kind of like more internal stuff, like a little like lower down, just like kind of the racism around me.
Uh-huh.
We had like a Krav Maga class once a week at this place called Caliber 3, which is in another settlement nearby. I think the official words they use, I think they dubbed themselves like a counter-terrorist training facility, and it's basically where um, like right-wing American Zionists go to LARP as IDF soldiers. Is more or less how I would describe it. Jerry Seinfeld has like gotten flack for going there more than once. That's always like a funny, bizarre claim to fame.
Uh-huh.
And we had a shooting class once, and the targets were literally just kind of like really racist caricatures of like terrorists, Palestinians wearing keffiyehs and holding knives. And even at the time, I was like, "This is messed up. Like this like feels weird." Um, and I remember the first time I remember hearing the word occupation. I must have heard it before this, but like I don't remember, and like I got the joke. Was my rabbi who lived in another nearby settlement complaining about how Israelis don't have like full access to the Temple Mount and aren't really able to pray on the Temple Mount, said Israel is occupied by Arabs. So is a rabbi from one settlement teaching a bunch of Americans in another settlement and saying that Israel is occupied by Arabs. So kind of just like the complete doublespeak that is going on in these communities.
Yeah.
And finished that, really had a positive experience overall, like really had a fun year where I was able to kind of explore myself religiously and somewhat politically and just like broadly morally and figure out my own values. And got to college, kind of separately drifted away from Orthodoxy and was becoming a lot more in touch with my like literal lowercase l liberal values that I always had, but didn't really have the vocabulary to express given my upbringing. And a really good friend of mine who grew up the exact same way as me, like, different town, different school, but kind of copy and paste, same idea. Spent 2 years learning in Jewish studies yeshiva in the old city of Jerusalem, then went to Cornell and kind of came back and was all of a sudden talking about the occupation a lot and like really vocalizing criticism of Israel and of the occupation that I had never really heard before, or only ever heard it as like characterized propaganda that we were taught to debunk. Certainly, it was my first time hearing it from an actual friend of mine and from somebody who grew up the exact same way as me. And I remember it was like hard, like it really, really challenged me and like really made me uncomfortable. And kind of eventually, I kind of realized, okay, I don't know where I fit into all this or what I think of all of this, but it's clearly not as simple and as one sided as I've been taught. And I'm like, gonna have to actually think about it at some point. And like, I'm not doing that now. We'll do that later. And that got the ball rolling. I kind of started reading a little more, just kind of like Googling Israeli news and Israeli politicians and like figuring out what I thought. Like I remember, like really vividly remember the moment that I realized that Bibi Netanyahu was like a horrific racist. And I was like, huh, okay. um, and then my last semester of college, where I would say I definitely had like kind of already made a lot of progress in this political journey by that point. This Palestinian guy from Bethlehem came to speak to the Hillel at my university, Hillel being kind of the international Jewish cultural club that's present at a lot of universities, or certainly a lot of American universities. I'm not sure if it's international. And varies a little bit campus to campus, but overall is absolutely like a pretty hardline Zionist institution, which makes the story very funny.
Mhm.
Um, the Hillel at my college was definitely more to the left than the average, I would say, just because of the student body and where they were able to drag it. And we got this Palestinian guy from Bethlehem to come and talk. I don't even really remember specifically what about. I guess just kind of like his life and experience. And he was, my age. He was in college. He was in a different university.
Mhm.
And it really resonated with me that Bethlehem was right next to Efrat, the settlement that I lived in. And I remember very naively thinking, oh, we were neighbors. Um, and he kind of completely in passing mentioned needing to get a permit to go to Jordan to fly to the U.S. to get to college because he couldn't go through Ben Gurion and all this stuff, and like really, really, it really hit me that I even kind of knew which checkpoint he was talking about, or now I know that I didn't know which checkpoint he was talking about, because he, even if he got into Israel, he wouldn't have used the same checkpoint that I always use. He would have used checkpoint 300 from Bethlehem, um, which, only kind of strengthens the point. But it really resonated with me from that proximity. And I remember thinking, like, oh, I hopped on a plane and landed there and just kind of like walked around like I owned the place. Like the checkpoint was a joke for us. It was a little game of like, what's the dumbest song we could blast as loudly as possible while driving through it.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, oh, that's apartheid. And that really, really was like the point of no return, I would say. And I think around that time, maybe before, maybe after, was already kind of exploring this stuff and looking away for a way to. I don't think I thought I was gonna like become an activist. I think I just wanted to like really concretely know more. Um, and basically kind of rewinding and coming forward for a second, really since my gap year, and since that overall really enjoyable year in this place, I always wanted to come back, and like always kind of thought about certainly spending more time here, and definitely, and like probably also living here for like really a long period of time. I really wanted to become fluent in Hebrew. I grew up kind of learning Hebrew for text and for Jewish studies, and with like a tiny bit of modern spoken Hebrew thrown in there, but really, really, was lacking in that regard compared to where I felt I should be given my upbringing, and definitely where I wanted to be to have that relationship with my religion and culture and heritage. And then in 2019, I applied to grad school, and I applied to Tel Aviv University, and I applied to Hunter College in New York. And basically, Tel Aviv University got back to me first, and they accepted me. And I decided, okay, I'm going to wait till I hear back from Hunter to make a decision. And very, very quickly realized that I wanted Hunter to reject me.
Mhm.
And that kind of was a pretty loud signal of what I actually wanted.
Mhm.
And then I made the decision and came here, and knew that I wanted to be involved in activism, even though I didn't really know what that would mean or look like. I wasn't an activist before and didn't know what activism on the ground here looked like, but just kind of knew that that was part of the deal to me. I couldn't just come here and like hang out and smoke weed on the beach in Tel Aviv. And reached out to a bunch of different NGOs and groups, and eventually, long story short, found this group called All That's Left, which is a grassroots, non-hierarchical collective of international Jews living here on the ground and engaging in activism in like a lot of different forms of activism and solidarity work. And I really threw myself into that, and kind of very quickly, my my thought of like who I was and what I was doing shifted to, oh, I'm in grad school to become an English teacher, and also I do this activism when I can, to like I'm an activist and I'm in this master's program that I don't really care about. So then I withdrew from that program in January 2020, by the way, which like great time to have a quarter life crisis. Right before the pandemic, and basically moved to Jerusalem to be closer to the West Bank, closer to the activist community, kind of like more in the thick of things,
Mm.
and really, really, you know, once again, kind of like up the ante and threw myself into that. Was going into the West Bank at least once a week, probably more, doing a lot of what we call protective presence, basically being as non-Palestinians at all, but certainly as as Jews, a lot of us with Israeli citizenship, or American, or like kind of like very, very high up on the totem pole of privilege here. Um, and kind of just being in these communities in times of concern to document anything that might happen, and hope that just by us being there, violence from Israel in all of its capacity, like settlers, army, whatever it is, that like that violence is less likely when we're around.
Mhm.
And it started very, very kind of like on request. Like we would get calls from Palestinian activists that we were in touch with, like, hey, we're worried that there's going to be a demolition tomorrow or a night raid tonight or an attack or whatever it is. Can you send some activists? And I was doing that a lot. Like, I remember, like, pretty quickly, there were times where I was effectively just going back and forth, would like go and sleep somewhere, wake up, drive back, shower, take a nap, drive
Mhm.
back down. Um, and then that spring, I did a program called Hinenu with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, where you basically live in Masafer Yatta for 3 months in the South Hebron Hills and just do that work full time with none of the um, you know waste of energy of going back and forth.
Yeah.
And that was a really, really formative, amazing experience. I think in a lot of ways, even though I was like certainly committed before, I think in a lot of ways that is what shifted it from like this is who I am. Like that was when it became like this is this struggle is my life, and like there's no turning back.
Mhm. Is your family supportive of your solidarity work?
No is the shortest answer.
Uh-huh. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in Masafayata of late, specifically since October? And maybe you can share a little bit about, in your observations, how things have changed also.
Yeah, definitely. Really after October 7th, kind of everything changed. And something that I've started saying is that it's not October 8th anymore. Things have calmed down a little, but it'll never be October 6th ever again. October 2023 in the aftermath of October 7th, there were just like massive, massive spikes in violence and really like ramping crazy settler attacks and targeting non-Palestinian activists, or I wouldn't say targeting, but like not relenting towards non-Palestinian activists in a way that felt unprecedented, to the point that there were actually conversations around of like, can we do protective presence still? Does our presence still offer protection, or are we just kind of also fair game? And while the stakes have definitely been raised, I think we can now kind of say that like, no, it does still offer protective presence. It does still work. And since then, like immediately after October 7th, I actually kind of wasn't spending so much time in Masafriata specifically for a lot of like different personal internal reasons that aren't worth getting into. But I basically was spending way more time in the Jordan Valley than in
Okay.
Masafriata. But this past year, that um, changed slash reverted to normalcy. Like Masafriata was always the norm for me. That was always where I was spending the most time, and kind of was finally able to return back to that. Um, I was working as a field coordinator for an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights in Masafriata, and that was kind of since Hineno, I'd always had the idea to just move there, and then but I would always stop and think and be like, "Oh, that actually is like not possible for me right now." And then I got that job with Rabbis for Human Rights and had a car for the first time, and was like, and had that idea for the millionth time, and was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, we can totally do this. Like this is gonna work." And I spoke to one of the communities, to some of the guys in a village called Umalkhair, and they were, like, absolutely. A friend just told me that he like kind of didn't think I was actually going to do it at first. He was like, "Oh," he was like, "Well, but he was like amazing," but didn't really believe me. Um, and then I did it, and kind of my job for Rabbi Human Rights entailed of kind of bringing activists down to join for protective presence, like volunteers, on a day to day basis, like mostly kind of people um, living within the Green Line, and just come down for a day or a night or two, and some other stuff, kind of organizing larger tours and visits every now and then, and like we did a whole lot of programming around the olive harvest, joining a bunch of different villages all over the West Bank. We do this every single year, joining them for the olive harvest with like 20, 30, 40, 50 volunteers sometimes. Similar thing for tree planting in January, kind of around the season for planting the trees, and then in harvest you go and pick them. Um, and just kind of trying to like expand the circle of activism, expand the communities that we're in touch with. Now we're offering solidarity and being in touch with everyone and being kind of like the guy that people call, that the local Palestinians call when they need something. Not for I don't want to like toot my own horn too much. There's like a incredibly impressive mechanism that's in place, and there are like dozens of Palestinians that are in touch with other activists when they need something. But that is definitely part of what I was trying to offer, and just kind of driving around all the time. Something specific about Masafer Yatta is that a lot of the communities are clustered together so much that like if an activist is in one community and something happens in another community, they can like hop in the car and be there in 5, 10, 15 minutes. And that really, we started calling it rapid response. And that's really, really kind of like something that's characteristic of the activist movement in Masafer Yatta.
Yeah. Yeah, I specifically remember some of those rapid response calls. Could you give me a bit of insight into your observations around how things changed in the occupied West Bank after the ceasefire was initially declared in Gaza?
Yeah, absolutely. So right away, you know, this part's pretty blatant and well known and like talked about, certainly at least in Israeli politics, that like the deal that Bibi effectively made, that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, effectively made to get his far right coalition partners, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Vitaly Smotrich, to get on board with the ceasefire that they were incredibly anti and like threatened to collapse the coalition over, was um, shifting things to the West Bank, basically. I forgot the exact kind of like terminology that they use, but it was basically like increase operation in the West Bank and increase like security in what they call Yehuda, Vishomron, Judea, and Samaria. And we saw that immediately. Settler, there was massive settler retaliation to the ceasefire that the settler movement overwhelmingly opposed, and a massive uptick in military presence, especially kind of around the cities. So getting in and out of the cities became much, much harder. There were checkpoints way more often and gates closed way more often, and like a massive increase in barriers put up and restriction of Palestinian movement. I know that like very shortly after the ceasefire, somebody in Masafer Yatta did pass away because they needed medical attention and couldn't get into Yatta to get to the nearest clinic or hospital. Um, and that aspect of it really, really stayed, was like the new characteristic of the new normal. And I would say doesn't feel like it feels like it's maybe reverted a little, but even since the ceasefire has kind of officially been broken, it's closer to after than before. That massive uptick in surveillance and checkpoints and barriers has like mostly stayed.
Mm. How has your understanding of Zionism changed through your work as an activist?
Um, I would say probably most of like the shift in understanding came before I became an activist, or at least in the very early days as I was becoming an activist.
Mhm.
I grew up, I didn't think about the word too much. Like I certainly would have called myself a Zionist, but we all would have. So it wasn't like a something I thought about or a defining feature. Um, and then kind of as I was going through this whole political journey and learning this whole side of things that was hidden from me, I never too much thought about the label. I definitely had a connection in this to this place, and for like a while was kind of, I would say, in this funny zone where a lot of people would have called me an anti-Zionist, and a lot of people would have called me a Zionist, and like I didn't really know or care. I didn't really think about it too much, and I guess I don't have like such a good relationship with labels. And I do remember learning about the um, joined Israeli-Palestinian NGO Zochrot, that kind of in contrast to the vast majority of left-wing NGOs here that really, really, for valid reason, focus on the occupation of the West Bank. Um, Zochrot specifically and entirely focuses on tours and education around the Nakba and around 1948 and around Palestinian oppression, you know, since then. And um, I remember learning about them and reading some of their sort of mission statements on their website. And one of the things is that they vocally and adamantly advocate for Palestinian right of return, which is, very, very seen as very, very radical. Um, and it kind of just made perfect sense to me, especially as somebody who grew up like so acutely aware of the Jewish right of return for, any Jew in the world to get Israeli citizenship. I was
Right.
kind of just like, right, like, yeah, if they were kicked out, they should be allowed to come back.
Yeah.
And I definitely had this thought, I think, however abstractly, of like, if you believe in the Palestinian right of return, you can call yourself whatever you want. You're not a Zionist. Like that's just kind of like the reality on the ground is that like those two things are diametrically opposed to each other. And the word Zionist is like kind of completely obfuscated in a lot of the discourse. Certainly, the communities I grew up in is kind of this like very, very abstract thing of like loving Israel or Jews have a connection to this land or like have like the right to live here, which like nobody actually questions, or like nobody with like any valid, political opinion like questions like people's like right to live in a given place. It's what you do in like the capacity in which you're living there. Um, and kind of like through all of this learning, like really formed a concrete understanding of Zionism as the politically ideology championed, like largely by Theodore Herzl of, colonizing Palestine. This is the word that he would have used, and in whatever capacity, kicking out the native Arabs, the indigenous Palestinians, and forming a Jewish ethno state kind of based on the norms of nationalism that existed in Europe at the time of this conception. Ironically, it kind of is like the most assimilationist ideology possible, even though now kind of people, especially in like the religious Zionist world, try and frame it as this, reclaiming of Jewish identity and like we're not part of the West, we're Jewish, Israeli, indigenous, whatever it is. There's a lot of kind of like reclaiming and co-opting of indigenous language, but it is the European nationalist movement based off of the surrounding contemporaries, and in that vein, really excluded non-European Jews in its earliest forms.
Mm. Tell me why you do what you do.
Um, it's funny that's like kind of the hardest question to answer, even though it should be the simplest. I think it's so I don't think about it anymore. I just kind of like I don't um one of my friends like as just kind of as a random joke once said about me and my twin brother like yeah there are some people are planners, the Steins aren't planners, they're doers, like they just show up and do stuff. Um, and like I said, moving here, I knew at the time came with responsibility that I couldn't just, like I said, smoke weed on the beach in Tel Aviv. And so that's like broadly how I knew I needed to do something and didn't really know what that would look like. And kind of for whatever reason ended up in this niche. I think almost especially with like the documenting aspect that's really, really crucial to this form of activism of filming every single thing that happens. for legal evidence, for NGOs to kind of build data and case studies, and just for outreach and awareness raising, that really, really resonated with me, coming from the background that I come from and really wanting to reach that world. There were times when the thing that kind of got me through the door in the morning wasn't even so much the literal protective presence, it was the documenting and the bearing witness and the awareness raising. Like, I'm going to film this stuff to show to the people that I grew up with, and to be able to say, like, no, I filmed this. This isn't, you can't really, without disrespecting me, a person that you know in real life, you can't like roll your eyes and say this is propaganda or Pallywood or whatever. Like, I was there and took this video.
Yeah, it's such an important part. I understand that you were arrested recently.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you comfortable sharing?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, if those who are listening.
Yeah. So, kind of long story short, I, for work, went to go to this community, this Palestinian community that like fled their homes for settler violence and went to a nearby city and had permission from the Israeli Supreme Court to go like with protection from the army back to their land. And I went, kind of representing rabbis for human rights, went to join them for that. And right away, I had to park really far away because of like a gate that was up, and get picked up on the other side of the gate and driven the rest of the way. And very, very quickly, the army came, almost definitely called by nearby settlers that were like up on the hill, and kicked me out because it was Area B. And then kind of effectively, the Palestinians also left. So that like already kind of shows how like they get to say that they didn't break the military order, they didn't break the Supreme Court order, that they have to protect these people. They kicked out me. But obviously, once I was kicked out, the Palestinians didn't feel safe to stay. So I have to take like a very long, convoluted way to get all the way back to my car. And kind of when I get back to my car, I parked right next to a military pillbox, which in hindsight was not wise of me. But right away, two or three soldiers came up to me and one volunteer that was with me and started asking me questions about what I was doing, where I was, whatever. And asked for my ID, which I gave, and became pretty aggressive and started filming us, and like one of them stuck his phone like really right in the volunteer's face, and then I started filming, and then he kind of said, "Oh, you just wasted 6 hours of your life," and started attacking me, like beating the shit out of me, just like really, really aggressively, like hitting me, you know grabbing, trying to steal my phone, threw me to the ground, kept hitting me, and was like twisting my arm, like telling me to like roll over this way and that way, when like while um, you know, twisting my arm and bending my arm and like restricting my movement. And something they hit me with like something that wasn't flesh. I think it was his gun. I'm not really sure. Um, I had a black eye the next day and did steal my phone. Um, Tried opening it with face lock, which I didn't have, and then like demanded I give him the code, which legally I don't have to. But he very explicitly threatened to kill me if I didn't,
Sorry,
and
could
zip tied
you say that
me.
again? Sorry, Sam, could you just repeat that last piece?
Yeah, so he demanded that I give him the code to my phone, which legally I don't have to, but he threatened to kill me if I wouldn't. Um, he also, I kind of internalized and realized this later, even though I think I kind of knew at the time, very clearly thought I was Palestinian. And that's kind of like the part of all of this that has to be mentioned and out in the open. This was happening under the premise that I was Palestinian, and like effectively I was Palestinian for these 10 minutes. In terms of like the armies and states' relationship to me, and um, norms around how I get treated. And they zip tied me. He was gonna put my head in like a shopping bag, and one of his unit, buddies or commander or whatever, decided that would be a little too far. They blindfolded me and dragged me into the military base. And threatened me some more, hit me a little. Um, I think looked at my ID. I don't really remember. And it's funny, like even though they saw my Israeli ID, I think they kind of like still like just because of like where I was when this all started, kind of still assumed I was Palestinian. Just thought I was a Palestinian citizen of Israel or something. And then like I don't remember. I started speaking Hebrew and some other stuff, and they eventually figured out that I was Jewish and Jewish Israeli citizen. And one of them said like, "Oh, he must be Jewish. He's apparently Jewish. He goes by his name is Shmuel, like the Hebrew version of Sam, and he speaks Hebrew." Um, and that even started this whole debate amongst the soldiers, kind of like how much that mattered right then and there. Everyone agreed that it mattered, just like how much. Because like, fine, I'm Jewish, but I'm a traitor or whatever. One of them said to me more than once. He said the exact same thing more than once. Like, oh, Arabs don't like traitors, and when they kill you, like you're going to be the first one they kill. Very. There's like a through line of like kind of violent settlers and right wing and soldiers and like far right wingers always telling me that sort of stuff, like while they're the ones being violent.
Right.
So very, very literally Kafkaesque going on. And when that happened, like despite kind of pushback from some of the more extreme soldiers who were kind of like, I don't care if he's Jewish, he's a traitor, he's a brigade, like whatever, like things calmed down, drastically. It was night and day. Like one or two of them, like, you know, made some comments. One hit me like once or twice, kind of like kicked the back of my leg, like not hard, and that was really it. I just kind of like they even cut my zip ties and like when they reapplied new ones, made it way, way looser and redid my blindfold and like not even like I could like kind of see out of my left eye for the rest of the time. Um, and they eventually let the volunteer who was with me, who was an American, they just let him go. They released him and dropped him off at some bus stop and sent him home. But they held me and eventually held me over to the police and arrested me, which is kind of like the protocol in these situations. Like the army can detain someone for a certain amount of time and then have to either let them go or give them to the police to be arrested.
Hmm.
And yeah, then the police brought me to the station. The Even then when I got to the police station, there was this whole like every single cop was like, "Wait, is he Jewish or Palestinian? Is he a citizen? Is he a naturalist? Is he like a tourist? Whatever." Like they were all very, very confused and didn't really like know what I am, which is hilarious and absurd to me. And kind of shows how much this is all like completely made up and like so constructed. Like I have friends that tell me that I'm like the most Jewish looking person in the world. Like people always tell me I look like Ben Shapiro. And then in this context, just because like we don't actually really use like physical appearance to like kind of code people that much, we use a lot of other stuff. They just like didn't know. Um, Even though it's like so checkable, like I said, it's a Shmuel Avram on my ID. And they, yeah, they like took all my zip ties, like literally made me like wait outside while they smoked a freaking cigarette before like starting to process me. And were like, especially the cops that like actually picked me up to the police station and brought me in, were definitely like antagonistic. Um, but the violence stopped. There was no physical violence anymore. They didn't give me privacy with my lawyer. I was kind of like whispering to her on the phone while they like wouldn't leave the room, even though I told them to a bunch of times. And then when I asked for, they said I was going to be interrogated. They were like bringing me to the interrogation room, and I said like I want a translator, which you legally have the right to be translated in basically whatever language you want. Um, and they were like, "Oh, but you speak Hebrew." I'm like, "Okay, like I don't care. Like, too bad. I still want a translator. That's not how the law works." And they just kind of didn't give me one. The woman who did my interrogation, who was like kind of the way in my experience is that it usually works in this is that kind of like the more it trickles down and the more you get handed over, the less invested the individual cop is and like the less antagonistic it all is. Like it's all part of the abusive system, but kind of like on an interpersonal level, by the time you're like three steps removed and they like vaguely know what you did or didn't do and what you're being accused of. They just like don't really care anymore. So that definitely happened by the end of this. By the time I was like dealing with this woman cop who would interrogate me, it was like fine, like she didn't really care. But she, when I asked for a translator, just said like, it's fine. I also speak English. I'm like, that's not like that does not count. Whatever. So I kind of just did my interrogation in Hebrew, um, which was annoying but fine. And I was accused of assaulting a soldier. And like even while the soldier was attacking me, he said like more than once, like, "Oh, you attacked a soldier, you're in big trouble."
Mhm.
Um, and they interrogate me. It was like fine, like I said, like really kind of like in terms of experiences that I'd had, in terms of experience that friends of mine had had, like really on the part of an abusive system, but on the better end of that spectrum. And basically, eventually, they let me go with no charges and banned me from like the location of the incident for 15 days, which really, really like it's like a funny moment of like highlighting the gaslighting of all of it, of like accusing me of this like serious, serious crime that they both like legally comes with massive consequences, and that they have like the most personal um that like personal bias reason to like throw the book and like accusing me of that, and then to be like, "Okay, like go home, you're like banned from this 100-foot radius for 15 days." Like on some level, they clearly knew that it was all bullshit.
Sure.
And yeah, that kind of was that whole story. I posted about it on Instagram. The cops still have my phone, so unfortunately, I don't have like any. And obviously, it's pretty hard to document while you're getting attacked. So unfortunately, there's like no documentation of any of this. But
Mm,
that kind of got like a ton of um, online attention since I just kind of posted a video of like recapping the whole experience.
mm. Yeah, I'm really glad you're okay, and thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing that with us. I wonder, you've been on the ground for a while now, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
Six.
So 5 years, I would say like 5 years of like pretty intensely being on the ground, and for the past 6 months
Mhm,
living on the ground.
mhm. What do you think are some of the most poignant things that will stay with you when you leave?
I think kind of just the relationships I built and like the friendships I made like with Palestinians, across these boundaries, that like the occupation does not want us to be friends. Like there's, a lot to say about kind of defang notions of coexistence, that like it takes more than holding hands and being friends to get equality and to get justice. But at the same time, that's kind of the necessary first step. And that's so, so abundantly clear to anyone who's spent time in these communities. Like the occupation is built on this incredibly impressive job it's done of making itself unnoticeable by Israelis. And the second you're actually friends with Palestinians that are living under the occupation, you are pulling away that veil and, to whatever extent is possible, opting into that experience of like actually being exposed to and being even inconvenienced by the occupation. And it's so abundantly clear that like soldiers are threatened by us. Like soldiers are like set off and antagonistic about our existence in these spaces. Like the second that you're in one of these Palestinian communities, you are deemed suspicious or whatever it is, whether you're international, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Israeli. Um, and that kind of, if the occupation doesn't want you to do something, that is an incredibly good indicator that you should do it.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a lot of the world doesn't know because of the narratives that are painted, particularly of Palestinian men being terrorists. Yet in the South Hebron Hills, these communities are really staunchly nonviolent.
Yeah.
I'd actually really love to know if you could speak to Jewish people around the world right now, especially those feeling conflicted, what would you most want them to hear?
Um, I think just that you're not alone, that there are like hundreds and thousands of Jews around the world that are having these thoughts. And there are polls about it. There, especially in America, which is like very obviously kind of very quickly becoming the most progressive Jewish community in the world. There are like all these polls and statistics showing that American Jews, like 25% of American Jews consider Israel an apartheid state.
Mhm.
And the first time I saw that statistic, I kind of looked for some qualifier. Like 25% of young queer American Jews under the age of 30 in a massive city. Like, no, 25%, a quarter of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. And so, yeah, kind of just that you're not alone and that this doesn't contradict your Judaism at all. And that we need to speak up. I know so many people that have these views and are scared to speak up because of backlash, whether it's social or financial, or especially if they're kind of like working in the professional Jewish world and really, really have valid concerns about, um, suffering in their careers and their professional life. And there are too many of us. We have the numbers. If a critical mass of us spoke up, they cannot blacklist all of us and cannot disregard all of us and say that we're outliers or self-hating Jews or whatever.
Uh,
Um, so that's it. Like we need to sway. We need to sway the tide. Like we need to be vocal enough that these institutions just like have to, even if not, turn on a dime, just acknowledge us
mhm,
and not be able to like blacklist any dissent.
mm. I love that. And what would you say to people who claim it's too complicated or both sides are at fault?
Um, Everything's complicated. There are complexities to everything. There are complexities that need to be acknowledged, whether or not it's exactly what a just solution looks like, or how you factor kind of like Jews' status in history as very much oppressed people in the West and in the rest of the world, and how that factors into your analysis of things. There are complexities to everything, but kind of the end of the day, who's being oppressed and who's oppressing is incredibly simple.
Mhm. Yeah, indeed. And what are your thoughts on the oppressed becoming the oppressor?
Um, it's obviously sad, and I think it's kind of what's happened a lot of the time throughout history. None of this is unique. There's nothing new under the sun. Nothing is unique, and I think that also kind of like factors into this like mythicized complexities that like there are idiosyncrasies to everything, but you can look at history and use your critical analysis of other um, similar contexts and struggles to increase your understanding of this. And just kind of like on a micro interpersonal level, we know that abused people and traumatized people are likely to go on and be abusers. And on a macro level, the exact same thing is true. And that's kind of always been a feature of settler colonialism, is like get these oppressed people and these outcasts of society to be on the vanguard. The Europeans didn't send their rich aristocrats to colonize Turtle Island. They sent the like religious Puritans that they didn't like to go do it, and they sent Columbus, who was like considered this annoying weirdo, to go do it. And the Dutch did not send their elites to South Africa. It's the exact same thing. They sent kind of like the religious outcasts, and the British sent their prisoners to Australia. They kind of like in the most concrete way sent their outcasts to go colonize this land, and it's the exact same thing in Palestine. Herzl, like I mentioned before, kind of developed this very much assimilationist ideology that was like anti-Semitism is inescapable. The only way we can be safe is to kind of play their games and be European as much as possible and go colonize our own land the way that they all did. And all of the broader European support for early Zionism was kind of the way that they saw it was a win-win. Like, go get these Jews that we hate out of Europe by letting them colonize Palestine.
Mhm.
And even to the point that a lot of of the earliest Jewish pushback to Zionism and to this specific vision of Zionism that has kind of become what the ideology is, was from this place of like, you're telling me that I'm not part of this society. Like, what do you mean I'm not British? I've been here for generations. Like, what do you mean I'm not Polish? What do you mean I'm not European?
Yeah. So what's next?
So tomorrow night, actually, I am flying and moving to Boston to be with my partner there and kind of, keep up the struggle, find out exactly what that means for me to not be on the ground anymore. It would be a massive, massive transition after all this time, but kind of America's funding this. So in a very specific sense, it does feel like just as much as the front lines in a different way.
Absolutely.
Um, and keep up the fight there, and try and stand in solidarity with all the people suffering under the Trump regime. And I'll be back. But kind of like already thinking about what capacities I will want to and be able to come back, and I will definitely still be spending time on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me this evening. And thank you so much for all the work that you do. And I wish you all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for the support.